I'm Marnie Ward, and this is a lesson on negative painting. It's our first attempt at a video, so I hope it turns into something that's helpful for you. Sometimes the concept of negative painting can be a little bit confusing for people, so I'm going to try to make it simple before we actually do a demonstration. If you think of a white piece of paper and a drawing of a tree, and you want to paint that drawing positively, you would mix some brown paint and mix some green paint, and you'd come in and paint the trunk brown and you'd paint the leaves green, and that is how we paint positively. Now, when I started painting flowers, I actually studied botanical painting, and that's how botanical artists paint. They paint a flower or a vase of flowers in the middle, and there's negative space all around, which is just plain white paper. But after I painted for a while, I realized that I really cared about light, and I wanted my flowers to be the lightest thing, not the background. I wanted to show backlit flowers or flowers infused with some kind of light, and for that I needed a dark background. So I started painting the backgrounds first, and I painted them dark. And the flower was then defined by the dark surround, and that, in its simplest form, is negative painting. So my tree, if instead of painting a dark trunk, I paint dark or some kind of color on either side of the trunk, and the trunk is defined as a white shape, that's negative painting in its simplest. And I think that's fairly easy to understand. However, we can do a lot more with negative painting if we think of the importance of negative shapes. Now, if I have a tree or a flower and it's in the middle of a white piece of paper and all around it is just white, that's really boring. This amorphous white form is not very interesting. So what we want to do to make it more interesting is to make sure that parts of the flower or the leaves or the branches extend out to the edges of our rectangular piece of paper, and the edges of the paper then help define certain negative shapes. Negative shapes are also defined in between the various leaves. So we might get some little shapes that look like leaves themselves, but are actually the background and not the leaf. And we only realize that when we come and paint them in various colors. So what I want to do today with this drawing that I've got on here, which is a tree with branches and leaves, is to show you how we can make layers of painting that actually define depth in a painting. So every layer that we put color on will then create a different depth. So we can have the effect of multiple trees in the background at a little further distance, or leaves on a tree that are further back, because each one of them has an extra layer of paint on it. And to do that, what we have to do is wet the paper and define the most important positive shapes. We want to leave those unpainted. They will be the lightest shapes, and we'll finish painting them at the end. Everything else we'll paint around. And when we're designing a painting, we want to make sure that our shapes are not all evenly distributed. We want some large shapes, some medium-sized shapes, some smaller shapes, and we want the shapes to be interesting in themselves. So what I have here is I have a painting, and my daughter's going to come around gradually and show you this painting. Well, it's a drawing right now. And what I have here is a tree that's coming up from the lower left, and some leaves and some branches, and there's some rather large spaces, one here and one over here, because you need those for restfulness. And there are about 3 main clumps of leaves. There's one here, there's another little one here, and there's one over here. So they create a kind of movement within the painting, which the trunk of the tree does as well. There's a lot of smaller branches and smaller leaves up higher, and I'm not going to worry much about those right now. I'm going to wet over all of those, but I will wet around the main trunk, and I will wet around the main shapes of the leaves. So I'm just going to start doing that now. Now, the interesting thing is coming up right now. With these main sections of leaves, I'm not actually going to wet around every single leaf. I did wet around all 3 of those, but here, this main section in the front, I'm going to wet around the trunk, but I'm going to wet right over this particular leaf here and around this leaf, but over this leaf on the bottom. So those two leaves that are more in the background, I've wet right over them. I'm not saving them as my primary subject matter, as my primary positive space. And back here, I'm wetting over this one leaf that's behind the other two. They will become more positive in the second layer. But for now, I'll pick up a bit of that water before it drips too far. For now, I'm painting over them. So I'm only leaving dry my really primary positive shapes. There's another little negative space in there. That's a negative space. That's a negative space. This is a negative space here. And so are those. There's three main leaves here, and over here, again, we have sort of a biggish space. It's good to be aware of your signature before you start. Mine's usually somewhere in the bottom right-hand corner, so it's nice to make sure that there's some fairly light colored, uncomplicated paint there that it's easy to put a signature in. Now you can tell by tilting the paper what you've wet and whether you've left out something that you didn't mean to leave out, or whether something needs a little bit more water on it. This negative shape in here does need to be a little bit wetter. And I think that's good now, and we're ready to have some fun and add some color. So what I'm doing here, I'm going to bring this palette a little bit closer. I'm going to mix up, and I don't bother too much about color that's left on the palette from before. I'm going to mix up some French ultramarine blue, which is a granulating color, which means that it forms a nice texture. We'll talk more about that in another lesson. I'm mixing it with some burnt sienna. These two colors together make a gray, but I never want to mix them evenly. So I want some color that's more brown. I want some color that's more blue. And I'm going to add some sap green to this mixture because there are parts of this where I want to give the effect of background leaves. So I add this in here so that I can mix these as I go along. And I'm going to use another brush to bring in some yellow, because yellow can very easily get muddied up with that dark brush. And we might want a bit of yellow up here, because this up here, I'm just going to do it very quickly, but this is going to be sky and leaves. There's going to be a little bit of yellow popping in there as highlights for some of those leaves. And I also want a bit of yellow in this section here. This is just sort of a break between the sky and the lower, the sort of foreground background, if that makes any sense, which is this part. So that I can do anything I want with that later. So I'm kind of keeping my options open. And one more color. I'm going to add just a little bit of cerulean, very pale cerulean blue in here, because this is going to be give the suggestion of sky poking through. So some of these lighter bits, I might want the suggestion that there's some sky coming through there. Now we get to the main part, and this foreground background. I'm going to take a mixture here. That's a little too green. Have a little bit more brown. So we're going to come close to the trunk, and usually in the corner it's a little bit lighter color. We'll add a little bit more blue in here, and then we'll do the same thing on this side. And you can see how
how painting negatively around this trunk makes the trunk and the leaves here. Forgot I've washed right over that leaf, so I'm going to put some green there. But these other leaves that I left dry become defined by the paint. And carefully here around this leaf. Because this is the first go, I want to keep it fairly light in case I want to pull another leaf out of it. This was another leaf we were painting right over in the background here. And now I'm just going to let some of these colors mix a bit. I always want to let the colors mix on the paper and not mix them too much in advance. So over here we should see some granulation happening from the French ultramarine. And we want the colors to be, we don't want a drastic change from one side to the other side, but we can gradually, none of this is dry really, so I can't put my hand down. We want to gradually change the color behind there. Now this isn't a serious painting, it's a demo, and I don't want to spend too much time fussing about the details, but I do want to give you all the impression of how this is working. And we might want to pull other leaves out here. So when we're really around the leaves, we want it to be a little bit greenier so that we can use this background as other leaves in the future for other layers. Okay, I'm going to sign this. I just want a sort of fairly neutral color here, but I like a little bit more of that limey green in there. So it doesn't matter that much what your colors are. I tend to like a darker color underneath my main sort of feature leaves or flowers. So I'm going to darken that a little bit there. And I will continue to do these negative spaces or negative shapes. And you can see as I do them, how they define the other leaves. And that's really what negative painting is all about. It's painting around rather than painting directly. But we are going to let this dry in a minute or two, and when we come back we're going to try another layer on this, and we'll pull out some more leaves in a second layer. So you can see that I haven't been overly careful here with the edge, and I can try and make that a little bit better, but probably one of the edges of this trunk will end up being dark and one of the edges will end up being light. So I'm not too worried about it. You can see at this point it's kind of gotten lighter as it goes over here. I might decide I want to add before I let it dry. Oops. I forgot my French ultramarine was wet, which makes it a lot more intense than the other colors. But I might want to bring a little bit more dark color in here, just kind of for fun. also just to show you what the French ultramarine does and how it granulates. We won't worry too much about this sky part right now. So I'm going to have to tilt this paper different ways to get that granulation effect that I want. You can see, I think, how it starts to form an interesting texture when you move it around. And you can take a piece of Kleenex or paper towel if you want to, you know, bring out some more white spots either in the foreground. There's a light spot there and I kind of like it, so I might want to add a few more light spots. Or you can even do it with a little bit of water to get a little bit of some kind of texture, other texture in there. So now it's just a matter of letting this dry, and when it's dry, we'll try and pull out some more of those. Oh, I see one I missed. See a negative, an area that I should have painted right in here. This little negative shape will help define those leaves. So that's all for now. I'll come back when this is dry and we'll try another layer and see how that brings out another layer of depth, and how some of the background that's there right now will end up being other main leaves. Thanks. Hello again. We can see now that this painting has dried from the first layer of paint that we put on, and I'd just like to point out a couple of things. One is the granulating texture that you see, which has been achieved mainly by the use of the French ultramarine. So in areas that didn't have much French ultramarine, such as in here, there really isn't that kind of effect, that leathery sort of texture that I really like and that you can only get in watercolor. The second thing I want to point out is that it's quite a bit lighter than it was when we left it wet. Watercolor does dry lighter. So if you want the background to be one shot dark background, you need to come in quite a bit darker than what you want it to end up. However, for today's demonstration, we're doing negative painting, and that means coming in with layers. So with layers, you want to do a little bit more darker in each layer, and you do, unfortunately, have to go over that granulating effect, which does kind of destroy it a bit. So normally I would use that effect, just try to put it in very dark and leave it alone. So what I want to do today, and I'm going to start wetting right away. When you wet over some paint, you've got to try and use a fairly soft brush, which means you want at least some natural fibers in there, as acrylic tends to be a little bit harder, and you want to use a fairly light touch. You don't want to rub it, or you're going to lift off some of that paint, especially the granulating pigments. They tend to lift. Other pigments, called staining pigments, won't lift as much. Now, I've done that fairly with quite a lot of water, but I want to come in more carefully here. You can see this leaf here was one we decided to paint right over the first time, and now I want to paint around it. So I'm going to draw out this leaf, which wasn't there before. And this leaf, that I think I've already got water where I'm not supposed to. So I'm just going to lift this up a little bit. This leaf I actually drew in. So if you lose a leaf, and I've done that over here, this was a bit dark and I can't find, when it dried I couldn't find the leaf I'd drawn. So I just drew another couple of overlapping leaves. You might not be able to see them. In fact, I can't even see them very well. But you can draw in whatever you want on top of the painted surface. That will be what you're going to paint around next time. So I've got this painted around, And these will be our second layer of leaves. After we do the second layer, I'm going to attempt to do a third layer wet and wet. And wet and wet gives you softer edges. When you paint wet onto dry, as I'm doing here, you're going to get hard edges again, which is fine for our second layer of leaves. But I'd like to show you a third layer of leaves where the edges are soft, because each layer is progressively further back, and as you get further back, the edges do become softer. So don't even have to do that one really. I've got a couple that I've suggested in here, and then I'm not going to do the top on this pass. That's something that I'll worry about later. So that's enough water for now. I'm going to come in with some of my paint. These are the same colors that I used before. French ultramarine and burnt sienna, which give you the granulation, some green, and then there's some yellow added in. So where I think I might want to have some leaves in behind, I'm going to put kind of a greenish color. Actually, I need a bigger brush for that. Again, I'm going to pull out gently some leaves. When this dries, just a little bit more, enough so that I can do it wet on wet. But up here under this edge, I'm going to make it darker. There, that's good. And now, with a little smaller brush, I'm going to come around and outline another leaf. So there is a leaf that was background after the first layer of paint, and now it's a leaf. But you can see it's not, it has some texture on it that's remained from the first layer of paint, and it looks, because of that, as if it's pushed back a little bit. And there's that other leaf that was painted around. These weren't painted around very dark, so they're showing up fairly light, but they still look like they're further back than these ones. And now the two where the paint was darker, they are going to show up even more. Well, sorry, I think I said that backwards. They're going to show up, but they're going to be look like they're a little more in the background. So there's actually two leaves here, and I'll distinguish them later on. So you can see what kind of effect that has when the color is just coming through in a mottled sort of way. And I don't have to do the background evenly. I kind of like that light patch, so I'm just going to leave that there. So there's a few leaves, and over here we've got the same sort of thing. I've drawn a couple more leaves, and you don't have to draw them first. You can just come in and define them. The more confidence you get with this technique, you can just come in and draw around a leaf and create it. Maybe I'm a chicken, but I still prefer to draw it in first so that I know what I'm getting into. Keeping it fairly light down here again. Up here, there's the stem and part of that leaf. So we've just created that stem. It wasn't there before, but that belongs to this leaf. And there's another one here. I've lost this a little bit, so I'm going to fake it here. But just by adding the dark, I've created that leaf. And I think there was a little bit up here. I might get a little more sort of pale bluey colored up here. We're getting closer to the sky up here. And I'm just creating another leaf and the bottom part of the stem here, because there's a stem that goes down here. So there's that leaf, and maybe pull out another leaf here, or a couple. So to get the idea how these things come out more in the background. Now the other thing that I wanted to do was one of these, I think this one. I was wishing last night that I'd actually covered over this one with paint. So I'm going to do that now, and that will push this one back, and it will also allow a softer edge here, because this edge is going to, it's wet on wet now, so that edge is going to come in. And that's what I wanted to talk about for the last part of this demo on negative painting. Is it's nice to have some soft edges as the leaf gets more and more in the background. I'm going to put some green on the top part of this leaf, and it'll just kind of blend in, make that leaf blend in more. So you can come in on dry and get hard edges, but you can also come in when it's wet and create a few more. So this is almost ready to do that here. I'm going to add a little yellow in here while I'm waiting, because this leaf belongs to that, and I think it can stand a little bit of yellow. There you can see, if I add paint now, it's going to blend in more with the background. This is maybe a tiny bit too dry, but if I come in, well, I'll do one more thing first. Give it a chance to get a little bit drier. With watercolor, so much of it depends upon the wetness of the paper. You're always judging, is this the right time to do this, or do I need to wait and do something else? Go have a cup of tea, but keep your eye on it. I'm not sure what that is, but it's just the possibility of another leaf coming down there. If I don't like it later, I can go over it. What I want to do is pull out some just suggestions of leaves in here without making them very definite. So I'm going to need some darker color. I'll mix some green with some of my blue and brown to just make a sort of a greeny, darker color. And I'm going to just suggest, go around and suggest a couple of leaves here in the background by darkening a little bit around them. This will create very soft edges. The wetter it is, the softer the edges will be. And this may be too soft, but it just gives the effect that there are some leaves, but they're way back in the background here. And it's nice to take advantage of this effect that you can get with watercolor. So it's, I can try and lift out a little bit here to give these leaves some kind of connection with some kind of a stem there. And if I'd waited for it to dry a little bit longer, you've got, it would create a little bit of harder edge than it has now. So we'll just see if we can kind of reinforce that a little bit. Create some kind of interesting spaces, but a very soft edge here, very much in the background. And that edge will merge even more as the paint dries. So if you want some soft edges, just a suggestion of something, you can do that. And you can also soften some of these edges. For instance, this one, I think that's just a little bit too hard edged for what I'm looking for. I can just come and go over that a little bit. It'll still be there, but now I've just softened it up. So I'm layering, and I just continue to do this. I could do that with this too. I could put some yellow over it while it's still wet, and that leaf will still be there, but it will be a much softer edge than if I'd let it dry before I came in and painted it. So I hope this gives you some kind of an idea of how to create more layers of leaves, petals, background petals, whether you want a hard edge or a soft edge. and how it looks when you sculpt a leaf out of the layer of paint that you've done before. So that's it for now. Do try this technique. It's wonderful in the background. I can keep coming and create more and more layers. I'm going to lift a little bit of paint there. And if I don't like some of these, then I can just paint over them next time. So I could build another layer of, next time when it dries, draw another leaf in here and draw one that's even darker. So each layer is darker, and each leaf that gets created out of that layer will end up being darker as well. So I hope this has helped. If I ever get this finished, I might post it so that you can see what the end result looks like. Thanks. Bye.